Hi there, you've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-apologist.com, and today I'm very pleased to announce I'm here with a master apologist, according to your Twitter handle, and his name is Joshua Brister, and Joshua is a history teacher, I understand. So today we're going to chat about communism, atheism, capitalism, and Christianity, and sort of how they're all linked together. So thank you so much for coming on, and I'm going to turn it over to Joshua to introduce himself and share a little bit of his perspective on this.
Well, I wanted to, first of all, thank you for having me on. Indeed, I do have a background in philosophy and theology and religion and economics and history. I've taught all those subjects. I've, I've lived in South Korea. I've taught there a few different times. I've been studying this one issue for 20 years, and it's helped me when I teach in the public school system, in the high school level. I teach both United States history and world history. And I think my interest, but my background in these subjects help me really help the students to understand not just the trees, not just the particular things of history, but seeing the overall picture and how ideas do have consequences. This idea of collectivism has had a disastrous effect on history, and we need to take it seriously in where it comes from.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm actually really excited that you have been studying on collectivism too, because I study those as cross-cultural scales from Gert Hofstede and from Franz Trampenaars and Harry Triandis. There's a number of scholars who have looked into collectivist countries around the world, and you're right, the implications are horrific in some ways, especially when they go to the communist extreme. I mean, we've seen examples of how that doesn't work. And actually, they've been able to correlate gross domestic product in countries against levels of individualism. So you can see that the more successful economic countries and institutions are steeped in individualism.
Yes. The Austrian School of Economics, I don't know if you're fully or if you're aware of that, but indeed, you don't really need to be aware of it to know what methodological individualism is. And that's putting the person and the choices of free exchange at the center rather than making it about social classes and the labor theory of value, which have been, woefully inadequate as, we discuss or concern philosophy and economics and different issues like that. So yes, there is a reason why the West started to rule the world, to dominate the world about the year 1500. Rodney Stark, I don't know if you're familiar with that author. Um,
Yes.
the scholar well, he's a sociologist, and I've read a number of his books. I have one here, How the West Was Won, the Neglected Story of the Triumph of Modernity. I can't recommend this book enough. He goes through there were rational principles that a necessary element of that was our understanding of God, our presuppositions of what theology is that made it possible for the development of science, for the development of liberty and of democracy and of education, the university system. All these things either are from the Greeks, such as democracy, or find their culmination in the West, Western Europe, who took that to the extreme. And there was a reason why the West has dominated the rest of the world, as Neil Ferguson, the Harvard Harvard historian, has said. And he also has a YouTube series, How the West Has Dominated the Rest.
So are you familiar with, and I'm wondering if Rodney referenced him, but are you familiar with the World Values Surveys and Ron Engelhardt coming out of the University of Michigan?
I'm familiar with the World Value Surveys.
Oh, you
Not
good.
not
Okay.
that.
Why I asked that is because it's very interesting the way that the West has moved away toward what he calls secular rationalism, and in some ways, and away from traditional religious institutions. Which is kind of an interesting thing. So we see some of that playing out in some of the social democracies, but not so much in communism.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not entirely familiar with those authors that you did mention. I do have familiarity with the surveys, the various surveys, and how belief in God or a country that has this heritage or history of um, exceptionalism of celebrating rationality and the importance of the individual rather than the collective, how they have really you know came to surpass a lot of the rest of the world. There's a reason why European or why Columbus and various other European explorers took the risk, the financial risk, to go and discover new ways. It's that profit motive, um, that reward risk understanding of economics, not a base materialism, as Karl Marx would say, but it's a reward risk. And this is something Rodney Stark has argued.
Thanks for bringing up Karl Marx. I have to say before I even start this is I would highly recommend a video by Stefan Molyneux on Karl Marx. If you type in there Stefan Molyneux and Molyneux, it's fascinating. He does a really good job of looking at the dichotomy between Karl Marx's life and how he actually lived and what he said in his Communist Manifesto. I mean, he's completely was a leech himself. He was really a horrible person.
Mm-hmm.
But he wrote this Communist Manifesto as if something like that could work. And what was also very fascinating is Nietzsche, way back when, pointed to the fact that if communism does prevail, if something like that sort of ideology does prevail, that hundreds of millions of people would die. And he was quite,
Mm-hmm.
he portended that, and he was quite prescient. So.
Yeah, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky predicted that. They saw, not just the particulars of history, but the forest also. And this is one thing I try to get through to my kids. Why is history important? Well, it's important for this reason. And now I'm talking to someone. If I was talking to my students, not you, but to my students, history is important so we don't repeat it. So we learn the historical foundations of how we got to today. Um, and before we make the world in a different image, let's step back and look at this with humility and make sure, as Jordan Peterson might say, make sure our own house is in order.
Yeah,
And
it's funny. I was just
I
listening to
think
Jordan Peterson this morning.
yes, yeah, I do think that a lot of people don't take that seriously and try to, condemn society, much like Marx did, very much akin to Marx, reaping the benefits of Western society, having a Coca Cola or microwave, um, but then saying, the wealth needs to be redistributed. It's something where I think the ultimate criticism to Marx and this collectivist mindset is it's not livable. It doesn't meet the demands of live life.
I totally agree with you. And I think one of the reasons it's not livable is because it doesn't look at human basic motivations. Why do people do things? We do things because we want to achieve. And we want to achieve, it's a basic motivation. If you go back to McClelland from the 1960s, and when he talked about everyone has certain levels of a need for affiliation, a need for achievement, and a need for power. And the way he phrased power was more of a positive influence. But everyone has these basic needs. And so communism doesn't speak to that. Communism has everyone is going to get paid the same regardless of what your inputs are. And it doesn't make any sense. It's not something that is at all livable. And of course, there's extremes in communism where there are a handful of very wealthy people on the top of the hierarchy, on the top of the pyramid, who have tons of money and control and power, and everyone else is basically living like a pauper. So.
Yeah, and that's always going to happen under communism. It's not a serious approach, and I think the 20th century has shown that ideas do indeed have consequences. Um, if the more we go back to a communism or redistribution economy or a lifestyle, the more we're going to hinder the productive capacity of those individuals that under Price's law, the the square root of the square root of any society will reap the benefits. Let's say 10% will reap the benefits for 90%. What will do the productive capacity and surplus value for 90% of the the community or the town or civilization that they're living in, by treating everybody in the name of radical equality, treating everybody the same in the name of radical equality. You really hamper people's gifts and skills that they've worked on. So you're you're not treating people seriously. To treat a person seriously, we must look at the individual, this methodological individualism. That is what gave rise to the West.
Yeah, yeah, and exactly. You know, if we go back to Hofstede and the data he collected in the late 60s and early 70s from IBM from multiple countries around the world, United States was considered the most individualistic country in the world, and that's persisted. The people who've imitated his studies and collected more data, like the Globe studies, for example, has also indicated that the United States is the most individualistic country, and that served us very well. We could say, you know, our GDP is almost equivalent to that of the entire European Union and to China. So you've got China with about 5 times as many people, the European Union with 1.6 times as many people. Our GDP is equivalent, and it is because we have such an emphasis on entrepreneurship and innovation and creativity, and you can see that all coming out of Silicon Valley, and so it's really worked quite well for the United States. Now, and I want to define capitalism just in case people are wondering what that is. That's basically just private ownership, and so that's basic capitalism. So why would someone asked in the chat here, and I think it's a good question, how does capitalism, and I have my answer for this, but I want to see what you say, how does capitalism fit into Christianity? How would you say that those two go together?
Well, one of the landmarks of civilization, where I don't think we're just driven by evolutionary processes, but cultural innovations. And I think one of the biggest cultural innovations had to do with theology and codifying in the Ten Commandments. Um, this thing is property. We should not lust or for another person's property. I think I'm misquoting the particular commandment, but the Ten Commandments give a reason, a rationale for why we can have personal property, and also a theological notion of stewardship of the world, uh, of our own property. When we have those property rights, we have more an incentive to work hard for them. I remember when I'm teaching my students about Jamestown, the first successful English colony in 1607. Jamestown was an utter failure at first because the people tried to own the property there communally. It wasn't until later that um, people were given an incentive. They were given a certain amount of acreage and they could plant anything and reap a profit from that. That's what made Jamestown and actually, too, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, those are what made them successful. It's that incentive motivation. And I think this is one of the hills of this collectivist, Marxist, communist mindset.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's you know, it's funny. My son is just reading Jamestown now. They're teaching it in his 6th grade. So he's reading all about that. But I'm sorry, he's in 7th grade. What am I saying? I'm losing my mind. So no, when my son is in 7th grade and they're learning about Jamestown. And so I just worked with him on a book report on that. So, so that's kind of a coincidence. I want to go back. Are you familiar with Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of
Max Weber.
capitalism?
Absolutely. I am very familiar with that.
So what would you say, how would you like? I could go back to that, and what it was with Max was he made a very good argument. Now he was around at the turn of the last century, and I think this book was written somewhere around 1920 or 1930, but he makes a really good argument for why parts of the West have succeeded. And he said, instead of looking at the Catholic model, where people are focusing on, the afterlife and this life being something that we really can't have as much control on, and the meek will inherit the world, and that kind of thing, Weber basically posited that more of a that you can work really hard, and we have a strong, thrifty work ethic in Protestantism, and the idea is to work really hard, and you'll succeed that way. And you can actually find quite a few Bible verses in Psalms and Proverbs that speak to the value of hard work and using our spiritual gifts. So if I were to say that Christianity is steeped in some of these ideas, I would say that's fair. And I also would point out the parable of the Minas, which basically says you're supposed to invest in, and use your talents and multiply that way. So,
in preparation, the 20 or so minutes I had to prepare for this, I was looking over some of my prior notes that I really don't teach my class this. This is more advanced than a U.S. Social Studies class on U.S. history. But the Protestant work ethic, Weber, or Max Weber, that's how you say it in German, he really critiqued this Marxist collectivist mindset, in saying that it's because that the Protestants, and that we're talking here about England and and Flanders and the Netherlands especially, had this belief that work is a way we can worship God. It's not just Sunday in church, but it's actually where we can worship God. And when we take serious that what work requires is a time and clocking in and out at the right time, that is a way to worship God. So there isn't just worshiping God on Sunday. It's worshiping God in whatever we do, including making a profit, working hard and planning for the future, not just the immediate uh, circumstances or time. So the Protestant work ethic was revolutionary, and I do agree with it. But I think more broadly than that, I think Christianity, and it's both Catholic and Protestant, as well as others in Christendom, really have placed the importance of time, planning for the future, as opposed to other cultures. I think Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot in the Old Testament when he talks about something called sacrifice. Um, and I thought it was really uh, a great remark. He says, in order to sacrifice that which we hold uh, as of supreme value, we must plan for the future, giving up something right now of our immediate circumstances, so we'll have something more beneficial of it in the future. Um, so this idea of sacrifice and time, um, it was really monumental in the West, and you can see its roots all the way back in the Old Testament, in the theology, the theological presuppositions in the Old Testament. But yeah, I'm in full agreement with Max Weber's um, Protestant work ethic.
yeah, and I think you brought up a really good topic with the idea of time, because it is, one of the things that I do. I actually teach some cross-cultural stuff in my university, and one of the things that's really fascinating that has differentiated the West from other countries is our focus on time. In fact, in the United States, it's to a point where time is money, time is of the essence. You're wasting my time. I mean, this goes back to when they started really focusing on clocks and people showing up to work on time between, say, 9 and 5 or whatever your work hours are. It goes back to that. And that structure was able to help perpetuate or help ignite, I should say, the Industrial Revolution. And so, yeah, they've done a lot of studies on that that are fascinating.
Absolutely. You can go back to Eli Whitney when he created the cotton gin that actually well, part of the early industrial revolution, Robert Fulton and the steamboat, uh, the advanced clocks that were coming out of Europe. A lot of people say, um, China invented a lot of these things, such as firearms, way before Europe did. Um, and as Rodney Stark points out, that may be true, but it's Western Europe who put these inventions into practice. I believe it was the year 1367 in the Hundred Years' War in the Battle of Crécy where the first firearms were used. Uh, that made it where you didn't have to get the service of a knight, but it gave more power to the individual serfs because they could defend themselves now. So there have been bad and good things with these inventions, and where these inventions, which are centered around that presupposition of theology, uh, take us. And I'm talking here about the Industrial Revolution, where bombs can be created for bad, or we can, in the name of science, create hospitals. All this was required a necessary prerequisite of theology. Of They wouldn't have came about, and indeed they did not come about in China or the Arab societies or a plethora of others, African societies, for example. They came out of the West for a reason. This understanding of time, uh, putting off immediate gratification for a later period, was revolutionary in the West.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wanted to ask you, since you are a historian and you know about a lot of good topics that I'm not as deeply read on. I'm wondering about, what do you think about our founding fathers and the principles here in the United States upon which we built our declarations and that Constitution?
Well, our founding fathers, I don't think they would be too well pleased with the high school curriculum today. Again, I teach in high school. I teach history. Um, we we often have this false notion of there's some way we can't talk about God or religion in schools. That isn't what Jefferson. Even though Jefferson wasn't a Christian, um, our founders weren't deists. They, much of them, as Witherspoon John Witherspoon was a devout Christian. Um, I can go back to, excuse me, I'm talking about Benjamin Rush, was a devout Christian minister who they were schooled in Scotland at various universities like Aberdeen University. They were schooled in a philosophy called common sense realism. Now, the proponents of common sense realism were people like Thomas Reed, people who were in direct reply to skeptics such as David Hume and others who came were writing at that time. The Scottish common sense realism, and I'm talking about Aberdeen University and Glasgow University and others, that we can know things immediately through our sense perceptions. We don't need an intermediary, but we can know things directly. Um, and one of our key concepts on the founding was virtue, doing what is right. All of us playing a role in the country, in the republic. That's what they called it. It was a republic built on virtue. It's what the Greeks call eudaimonia, virtue. But doing what is right, not just thinking about immediate gratification, but doing what is right. And that's why many many people who formulated the law describe the law as friendly. Goes back to British common law. Um, friendly. It's without the passions. So yeah, our founding was very much centered, I would say, on an overall Judeo-Christian philosophy. a humble philosophy, not a particular denomination, but a philosophy that was built on virtue. Many of our founders, including John Adams and George Washington, saw the importance of Christianity and education in forming this eudaimonia, this virtue mindset in our kids, in young students, knowing the importance of our founding. Today, when I'm teaching, um, I believe our students don't have a lot of the basic historical knowledge um, as times past. Um,
No, they don't. And even if,
and I
like
think,
you mentioned this coming out of Greece and going back to Aristotle and virtue ethics, it's all related. That's not even Christian. Obviously, Aristotle preceded Christianity, but it's that whole idea of those sorts of values. So do you think that
yeah,
students today are getting a
well,
good history on places like Greece and because I think if you look at and spend a lot of time studying Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, I think you can get some really interesting perspectives on life.
yeah, absolutely. I do think there's wisdom in the ancients, but one thing our founders were emphasizing is this belief in virtue, how we should all work together, um, yeah, and do hard work. Thomas Jefferson was for an agriculture society, but we should all do hard work and do our part the polis built on virtue, that we're all in this together. And John Adams and Jefferson and others expressed it. We're very inclined to some sort of education system that was very sympathetic to the basic biblical teachings. Now, again, many of them were not explicit Christian people, but many of our founders, all 56 people who signed the Declaration of Independence, many of them were explicitly Christian and were outspoken Christians at that, where they were well trained. They knew the that knew the books, the philosophies going around England and Germany and all throughout the continent. These were bright men, um, men and women. Not too many women at that time, but there were uh, a lot that played a part. John Adams' wife, uh, extremely influential. The way that these people felt about the government built on virtue was very significant. It goes back to this common sense realism school in Scotland, which was not built on the skepticism of David Hume. It was built on we can know things directly through a common sense approach.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna have to go and do some more investigations on that because that's certainly interesting stuff. Let me ask you this: since we decided we were going to talk about atheism and communism today, what do you see historically as the
Finally,
relationship between those two? I know we have a few people who are
well,
watching right now who are in the atheist camp, so I'm sure they're really interested in what you have to say.
mhm. um, well, I don't think I don't think it necessarily makes you an atheist if you're a communist, but I think the reverse is true. Um, if you're an atheist, well, let me put this another way. Historically, the communist countries have been atheistic, have been of a collectivist mindset that does completely away with personal identity, people making profit, people working hard. This methodological individualism, which Max Weber uh, delineated on a number of occasions, including in the Protestant work ethic. Um, we have a historical record of the failure of atheism as a philosophy. The 20th century falsifies atheism, in my opinion.
How would you say that? How do you think the 20th century falsifies atheism? What's your backing on that?
Well, I would say atheism was tried in various regimes, including communist Russia, including North Korea and Cuba. Look at the death rate, including under Mao in China. And look at the death rate. More deaths have been caused by that within a short period of time because of specific ideas, collectivist ideas. They all have this conspicuously in common, this collectivist mindset. And I don't think um, it's a surprise when you get away and try to make the world and not take the history seriously, but when you try to make the world in your own image of what you think a world would be like, the eudaimonia in your own image, well, you get catastrophic results. So I do think if any if atheism could be falsified in any way, it's the 20th century is the best argument for that.
Yeah, so, well, certainly for I think communism itself. Now, let's go back. I'd like to mention all the people you brought up. So, if I were to talk about what's going on today, I've done a lot of investigations, and there's only a handful of countries who are still communist today. And you look at what's going on in those countries. President Xi in China, basically, they're actively persecuting Christians, still actively persecuting Christians, still going into churches and sending their atheist people in there to destroy them. There's lots and lots of information on that. In fact, I've got friends who go to China there, and a lot of students who come from China, and the level of censorship there is egregious. I mean, they can't say one thing about their president online without worrying that someone's going to show up the next day or within the day to arrest them. So it's just really pretty awful right now in China. If you go to North Korea, we have that Kim Jong Un, and he considers himself sort of a savior. He considers himself something on the level of a god. The same thing's going on in China, basically. If you go to Fidel Castro, and I know Fidel is passed away, but Fidel Castro initially capitalized on his relationship with the Catholic Church to put himself in power, and then he turned on them and he started basically being an atheist. So there's an example. I can't find, and maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't been able to find one communist leader who's not an atheist. I don't, or maybe I'm wrong. Have you found any? I've been trying to investigate.
Yeah, I can't recall of any. There may be, I simply cannot recall, and I've been studying this issue for a while. I have whole books on this issue. Um, let me show you one book that I've been going over, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, by a great author, Hans Hermann Hoppe. He is a German scholar. He used to teach at UNLV, a historian. He's an Austrian economist, and he can't find anything either. I'm trying to think, but there does seem that there is a pattern. Patterns arise for a reason. Normally, there's something to the pattern. Um, and we have the ability to detect patterns, of course. Um, so there's a good reason why the communist regimes have been led by outspoken atheists. There's a good reason why they have been tried to quell the church, trying to quell any individuals that speak for the individuals rather than the group as a whole. This belief in radical equality, this what I teach my students about what egalitarianism is, and that how egalitarianism can destroy the self. If you try to even out the playing field at the expense of the individuals on the ground, then inevitably you're going to make it by force, make it come about by force. Um, Jordan Peterson goes over this a lot too. So, a scholar I'm very fond of, but I think there's a reason why these communist leaders have been atheists.
Yeah, I went back and I pulled up Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto and quickly skimmed it in preparation for our meeting, but I'm going to go back and read it more thoroughly. But I
Yes.
quickly skimmed it to see what references he had to religion, and I saw quite a few. So basically, people who and Karl Marx was an atheist. So basically,
Yes.
the idea he's the one who started this whole notion, and he's the one that they used his Communist Manifesto. So I think that there is a relationship, probably for a reason.
Yes. Yes. I'm trying to find the quote on. Well, it's not just Karl Marx, it's all these Enlightenment type thinkers who think they, are somehow they're distinguished by the amount of education and the circles that they hang out. I'm talking here about people like Voltaire or Sigmund Freud, or you can go back to David Hume. All of these Enlightenment thinkers, or not all of them, but the majority of them, are predicting the end of religion. And it's conspicuous that Western Europe, or excuse me, Christianity, has never been uh, more on a growing path than it is now. I'm speaking of the South, in South America, in Africa, in Asia, where I taught in South Korea for 2 years. Um, Christianity is extreme on the rise, and I'm not even mentioning China. But when you give people incentives to work hard, and again, we're going back to this fundamental theological presupposition of time and the Protestant work ethic. But again, I think Christianity holds to this work ethic in some way. You see that there's a difference. There's a reason why some civilizations have surpassed in wealth and taking risk and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, over other civilizations. And I think that is Christianity. I want to show you one more thing. Let me get back on my camera. I was looking at a
I
document.
want to agree with what you said. I think that what's really interesting is because China has opened its doors to trade and has welcomed foreign direct investment and that kind of thing. We have noticed some very positive things coming out of China in some ways, and but I still see some persecution going on there. But as far as the
Mhm.
um, as far as its economics and its productivity, obviously they've been doing some positive things, and like you said, at one point I checked to see what the level of atheism was in China, and it was something like only 19% of people claimed that there was a God, or admitted, I should say, or was able to say it out in
Yeah,
public that there is a God. The other 81% basically
yeah.
indicated that they were atheists.
Well,
But what I'm
yeah,
seeing coming out of China, I've been seeing a lot of articles where there's pockets of Christians just are exploding over there. So I'm seeing
yeah.
some pretty neat things. So it'll be interesting to watch China's progress over the next, say, couple centuries. I won't
Let
be
me
around for the next
piggyback.
couple centuries, but I'll be around for a little bit.
Absolutely. And maybe that's a good thing on the way our education system is going. Let me piggyback on something you said. There are estimated today to be 100 million, anywhere between 60 and 120 million Christians in China. If that is true, and all indications show that, Rodney Stark and um, his associates have done some surveys. They've even asked communist members and even of the government and gone to their houses, which it's officially forbidden for them to be religion, but they've reported seeing crosses and different things in the rooms of the communist leaders. Um, anyway, China is exploding with Christianity. And as for them doing good economically, it was in the late 1970s when they started adopting free trade policies. That's how they've caught up to such an extent that when by the time you have it today, China is doing so great because they're recognizing property rights starting in the late 1970s. Now, I love to show some of these books that have really inspired me. One is again by this author, um, Rodney Stark, The Triumph of Christianity. I think I mentioned it. I'm not sure if I showed it earlier, but this is a great book that talks about some of these under, non-official surveys, because China will not let religious questions be asked. Um, if you believe in God, etc. It's officially against the law. And communist leaders, people who work for the government, can be held accountable for this. But there's a surge of people that have crosses in their house, are meeting in underground churches, that are claiming to be Christians, by what they do. And once people really start asking them in these surveys, I'm talking here about Rodney Stark and his associates. But I think in the outside world, not talking about Western Europe or America or Australia, but places like Asia and Africa and South America, um, and China, you have Christianity exploding. So, is there a secularization thesis going on? Does modernity equate with the loss of religion? No, not at all. Not if you ask these people in Asia, South America, Africa, and China. Christianity has won. It is clearly winning over any other viewpoint. Um, so I think there's a reason why Christianity is on the rise. Atheism is 4 or 5% in a lot of these surveys, including the World Survey.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I've seen atheism in different surveys worldwide. I see the numbers, from what I understand, is about 7% of people in the world are atheists. There are some countries where you have 99.9% of people believe in a higher power or believe in God. The United States, we're sort of an anomaly when you compare us to Europe, as far as Europe is trending more towards secularization and atheism. Actually, they've seen that, but the United States is an
Well,
anomaly in that we're
let me
very religious. We're very Christian here.
let me say something about that. There's a British sociologist named Grace Davies. Grace Davies. I want everyone to look this up. She says the supposed loss of religion in Europe is because um, there are believers there, Christians, without belonging to an official church. So Christianity is so well established in Europe, going through the Middle Ages, that they're they're taking it for granted. It's so firmly established in their philosophical understandings of the world and how they perceive reality, that they have the freedom to, you know, to to say that they don't belong to a church, or something akin to that. So I think the demise of religion and the triumph of the secularization thesis is premature and over exaggerated.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and I think you're making a really good point there, because that speaks to the people who self-identify as nuns, NONES. The people who
Yeah.
they could be Christian, but they just don't go to an organized church. They don't go to they don't regularly practice their religion in a church.
Because how we live our lives through at least 2,000 years, but before that, I would say we live our lives according to an accumulation of knowledge based on natural theology, finding out what works, the gods having evolved. There's a reason why the cultural innovation in the West of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and this is something I tell my students, there's a reason why it is so important. It's we're not, and I tell my students again this, we're not just the product of evolutionary processes, but of a progress of wisdom evolving through time, um, and seeing what the Bible means. What does it mean to be a Christian? What did Jesus mean when he said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you"? We take so many of these theological notions for granted, and we use them in how we see the world and treat other people as ends, not just means, as like a Karl Marx collectivist atheistic society would have us believe.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you there, and oh, I just forgot my point. I was going to build off that just a second ago, but I agree with you. So, somebody in the chat asked a little while ago, and I wanted to bring this question up. Hitler and Catholicism or Christianity. What are your thoughts? And I have very strong opinions on this, but I want to see what your thoughts are on Hitler and whether or not he was a Christian. In my view, he was harnessing Christianity in some ways to be able to get his points across and to influence people. But I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, which would be correct in any pathology going on within a human being. They're going to use um, religion, or use trying to seek agreement among people, and then try to use it against them. So you can find perhaps a few instances of where Hitler says something good about Christianity, but then inevitably, with all these regimes, you have them trying to get rid of the church, or trying, and again, I hate to keep going back to this one scholar, but Rodney Stark goes into detail about Hitler in this book, How the West Was Won, which I've shown earlier. There are other books that go into this. Rabbi Zacharias discusses this also in pretty much detail. But um, all these dictators have one thing in common: they're trying to manipulate people, and they do that on a regular basis. So I don't believe he was a Christian. I believe inevitably, because he was a product of his time, he's using um, unconsciously theological assumptions in his everyday life, but he's doing it to manipulating people to create a world in his own image. And this is, again, what all these dictators have in common. They want a utopia and create that utopia in their own image.
I agree. Yeah, and I mean, he certainly was manipulating. And the other point is with Hitler is I think seems really simple. He would a person who murdered 6 million Jews actually be truly worshiping a Jew, a Jewish carpenter, because that's basically what Jesus is. So, and I always think I listened to someone talking once about the fact that Jesus is a carpenter, his father is a carpenter. Isn't that really interesting when you think about that, the trade that he chose? Because that's a builder and
Well,
creator.
I think there are things in history that we can learn from in multiple different levels, not just the particulars, but maybe there's some deeper meaning into history. Maybe he is a builder. Maybe we should try to build society, not in our own image, but taking history seriously. Um, Including the Sermon on the Mount, and how we treat people with inalienable rights, as our founding shows. There's so many ways theology, Christian theology, Judeo-Christian theology, and philosophy have influenced America, have influenced the way we see the world, the different philosophies and the economic systems. They are so entrenched, more than what we even know, with this Christian philosophical approach. So even the atheist, when he denies it, there's so many things that the atheist is they're denying it with their lips, but affirming the truth of Christianity and belief in God by the way that they live their life.
Yeah,
There's
I see that because I've had people say to me and in fact, it's one of Christopher Hitchens, famous atheist, comments and saying, well, what moral act can a Christian do that an atheist can't do, or something like that? And he always was stumping a number of different people when he would say this. But what's interesting is, what is the moral act? Well, one of them is the very first thing we're supposed to do: love God above all else. And so, that's a moral act. And of course, you could be a pastor and say tithing is too.
Let me give you one more. To even think words and concepts have objective meaning, Christopher Hitchens would have to presuppose objective meaning, not arbitrary meaning in his own words. So he's referencing something that transcends a mere cultural milieu of language and of language games, as Wittgenstein would say. Uh, he's presupposing some standard that anchors the objective meaning of language. So he can't speak without presupposing that there is objective meaning to the words that he is saying.
That's yeah, I agree with you. That's interesting. Looking in the chat, and I see Chris Atheist Power has made a comment here that that actually I agree with. I never make the claim that all fascists uh, are atheists because I don't think that's true. I could be wrong, but going back to Mussolini and other fascists, again, that's the far right. So you've got the far left is communist, the far right is fascist. Neither form is a good form of politics. But I wouldn't make the claim about fascism and atheism. But maybe I'm wrong. What are your thoughts on that from a historical
Well,
perspective?
I totally agree with you. People, when they deviate from this, broadly speaking, this as C.S. Lewis would say, this broadly speaking mere Christianity, when they get out of this and start trying to remake our institutions in their own image or society, or radically change society, something that, the old British politician Edmund Burke would totally be against, the conservative Edmund Burke. Then you start having, this going away from an orderly conception of how we got to today in history. And how we got to today in history has a lot to do with 2,000 years of Christian history. And then it has even more to do with thousands of years of Jewish history that led up to that. And intermingled in that is other histories, and accumulation of knowledge, and they're molding together. When we try to deviate in a radical way, I'm not saying we can't improve society, but when we try to deviate, as the fascists did, much akin to the communists, then we're building, we're utopians. We're trying to build this new form of society rather than let it emerge naturally by open debate.
Yeah, I agree. You know, and I wanted to also say something that was just kind of on my mind is I'm thinking about people like Ayn Rand, and she's an example of an atheist who was very, very much a capitalist and an egoist. And I used to read her books thinking she was the most fascinating person in the world. I loved Atlas Shrugged, absolutely love that, love The Fountainhead. Um, but now I've gone back and reviewed her materials and realized where her perspective was arising from, so I don't want to try to make any sort of claim that all atheists are communists. That's absolutely not true. There are many atheists who are capitalists here in the United States, and there are people like Ayn Rand and actually the Church of Satan has adopted her, her
Yeah, and
philosophies. Like
that's
if you actually go into their website, you can see that they've actually taken all of her ideas and they've actually created their belief system off of those, which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's totally what that's in sync with what I believe. I don't believe all atheists are capitalists, or I mean, are communists, or the vice versa either, for that matter. I do believe that there is a tendency for atheists to to adopt communism, or I'm sorry, for communists to adopt atheism. Um, there's a historic reason, a pattern, and generally speaking, though not always, our intuitions and pattern recognition are, reliable. And if they weren't generally reliable, we could know nothing of the world, including who we're talking to. Um, but they are generally reliable, and maybe philosophies and ideas do have consequences. I think this idea has been falsified in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I see another person here is asking a question. Santa is my Lord is asking, how does master apologist know the labor theory of value is not a good theory, unless he's verified that it is not? Do you know the labor theory of?
Yes, yes. Well, unless he's verified, it's not. And how would a person verify it? Isn't that verificationism? So I would have to prove by some other external way that it's false. How about this? Let's look at it through the lens of live life and common sense. And again, I'm going back to this common sense realism school that originated in Scotland with Thomas Reid, which was so impactful on the founding of America. Um, the labor theory of value is only part of the story. Um, yes, labor does have something to say in determining the value of something, but so does um, our subjective view of what we put on of what of value. Um, we can't just take a labor theory and this objectivist labor theory of the amount of work, the amount of hours someone puts on something. We also have to take the subjective value. And that's why I do think that that it is false because we don't work like that. The Austrian economists they tried to compute or they tried to find out why are diamonds worth more than water? Well, if you're on a desert, what are you going to value more? You're going to value the water more than diamonds, that they will be more valuable. It's the situation um, that determines that um, the labor theory of value is a simplistic answer, and it's only looking at one
I,
level of
yeah,
interpretation.
let me
It's not
piggyback
looking at
on.
it deeper.
I'll agree with you on that, and I want to piggyback on what you're saying. You know, look at, for example, Jimi Hendrix guitar. Now, how much does Jimi Hendrix guitar cost versus how much is Jimi's Hendrix guitar worth? You know what I'm saying? So we attribute, I mean, we assign value to something by our perceptions of it. So if any famous person touches something or is shown in a movie with something, that something, and we can watch this in the Pawn Stars show. That something becomes worth a lot more than it's actually really, you know, truly worth. It should be valued at, because say his guitar is $2,000, I bet you he could get many multiples of that if he were to put it on the market.
Yeah. And as Jordan Peterson and others have shown or argued for, where does that value that value that we put on antiques or we put on something that has intrinsic value, where does it reside? It resides in interpersonal communication and space, interpersonal space. But that falsifies materialism, which says it has to reside in the labor. Um, so the labor theory of value, there's a reason why economists don't buy into that. And it's not philosophically informed.
Thanks. Yeah, and actually, maybe that's where I heard something on that was Jordan Peterson. I was trying to remember where I heard that because I think he might have used Elton John as an example if it is from him.
Oh,
I think he might have
yes.
used Elton John's piano. So just adding value to something subjectively. So, well, what do you think?
Let me add something
Oh,
to that.
yeah.
Let me add something to that. There's something called the marginal. Do you know what I'm talking about? The marginal returns.
Um,
Actually, I can't think. You know what? I'm gonna pass on that because it escapes my mind. I'm gonna pass on that.
Okay. You know, going back, I do remember one thing I was going to bring up a while back that you had touched on, which was on the golden rule. What's really interesting is I saw a study on universal principles and objective morality and objective moral values and objective moral duties, and this study looked at 7 different major world religions, and it looked at atheism, it looked at a humanist group, it looked at secular humanists, it even went into the American Atheist website, and this study came out, and it basically said that a golden rule or a form of it is something that's actually inherent throughout the world. It's in all religions that are major, and it's funny because people have argued with me. They say, well, Christianity didn't create the golden rule. Well, no, but isn't it kind of interesting that every religion adheres to that? So,
Well, I think that's the incredibleness of natural theology, how we can all have an understanding of these basic you don't have to call them theological principles, but these basic philosophical underpinnings of society. And it is Western culture, Western society, that has elevated and took the golden rule to a higher level. And it also elevated the status of women uh, and of other people. It condemns slavery. Um, this golden rule motif, understanding in Western society, just like inventions were first created in China, like the gun. Well, China was making fireworks out of that. They weren't using it to defend their nation. It was Western Europe starting in 1367 in the Hundred Years' War that started implementing these different technologies. This belief in authentic progress is what has made the West uh, be separate from the rest of the world.
yeah, that's a good point. I'm looking at the questions now. Questions are starting to come in, and I know we don't have too much time left, but I wanted to. There's one here from Debasish, and I'm sorry if I messed up the pronunciation of that name, but I have one more question. New atheists often claim that world will be a better place without religion or belief in God. They point out Scandinavian countries as an example. What's your thought on that? Now, I
Yeah,
can say what's interesting is in Scandinavian countries, they have been having an influx of Muslims in many of these countries, and especially Sweden. So they're going away from one religion, but possibly going towards another one. So,
well, and because of that, Sweden just elected very conservative politicians. The reason that in Scandinavia, they don't really, or they're having a backlash against all the immigrants that are coming in with Islamic immigrants, is because they come from a different philosophical background. Just remember, guys, what I said about Grace Davies, the British, the well-known British sociologist, who said that far from Britain losing its religious identity, it's people that aren't in the churches. They're believers without belonging in the church. Um, so, for the longest time, Britain has been, starting with Henry VIII, has been an official Christian denomination. Now, compare that with the US. There is no official religion. In fact, uh, well, I just forgot his name. The founder of Rhode Island, he wasn't for that. I'm trying to remember the name. I just taught it in last couple of weeks. Um, People in America have, without an official backing of religion, have voluntarily been accepting Christ for hundreds of years now. And religious participation is through the roof still in America. But far from that, it's exploding elsewhere. So this secularization thesis, what I think the Scandinavian uh, context is all about, where you can bring up particular countries. Christianity is going nowhere. It's migrating from the North, who has this false delusion of secular utopia, and it's going to the South, where people haven't benefited from materialism, haven't benefited from the material progress that the people in Western Europe and the United States have taken for granted. So that's why Christianity is spreading so far in the South and in China and elsewhere. It's not going anywhere. Ideas are transforming and are migrating. Perhaps someday Western Europe will again be Christianized once they see the pitfalls of radical materialism and what it does to their society.
Yeah, and I think that that brings up an important point is Christianity is the only religion that has spread far away from where it was in originally where it originally came about. So Christians are populating all countries of the world, and it's pretty amazing when you think about it. The central hub of Christianity could well be considered the United States in some ways, but certainly at one point in Europe. So it's moved away from its original location, unlike all other religions. So if you look at other religions, they're usually centered right around where they were founded in the first place. So it's kind of interesting. I see Roger Williams. That's I looked it up for you for Rhode Island. I don't know if you wanted to say something about him. Okay, no, I didn't know if you wanted to say something about Roger Williams.
Yes, it's Roger Williams. That's who I was talking about. He believed in that separation of church and state, but he was an advocate of Christianity. He believed that Christianity was an essential thing. So was the founder of Pennsylvania. Um, Name escapes me again.
I have to look that up too. I don't know.
So is the founder of many of these colonies. We can't get the religious history and how it's entangled in the overall historical context of America, or before that, of the Middle Ages, and how that influenced Europe and Asia and Africa and elsewhere.
Well,
Christianity is why the West won.
That's, and speaking of those founders, and even going all the way back to Jesus, he said, give to God what is God, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So that's separation of church and state right there. So I wanted to see...
I've listened to some...
Okay. Do you want to go ahead and wrap up here, Joshua? Yeah. So we'll go ahead and tie this up. So I wanted to say thank you so much for, William Penn founded Pennsylvania. Thank you, Bob's Opinions. So should have known it was in his namesake. I won't forget that one. I'll remember that. I should have remembered that. Okay, so what I wanted to say is, how can people find you if they wanted to reach you? I don't know if you have active blogs. I know that you and I connected on Twitter. So how can people find you?
Yes. Well, I'm at Twitter, a master apologist, but I also have a Promethean account. It's Joshua J. Brister. I'm hoping this conversation gets on, and I hope we can combat some of these secular infidel types, these new atheist types like Sam Harris in the future. I'd really like to discuss that with you. But you can find me at Master Apologist on Twitter, or Joshua J. Brister. That's my name on my Promethean account.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I wanted to thank everybody who's come in today and listened. I see Bon Jones and Bob's Opinions and Debasish and Chris Atheist Power, who followed me on Twitter. So I went ahead and followed Chris back. So anyway, I thank everyone for joining us. And thank you so much, Joshua, for sharing your intellectual knowledge on so many of these great points, and your historical knowledge, I should say. And so I really appreciate that. Okay, so if you want to find,
I think I think you're very bright. Also, you raised so many great points, and I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, well, thank you. We can certainly do it again. I think I'd like to discuss Sam Harris's views on things. In fact, I find them highly flawed, and I've written blogs to that effect. So I would love to talk about that. So maybe next time you and I can dig through that Sam Harris. And you probably have watched the same debates I've seen, but have you seen the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson debates?
Yes, many times.
Yeah, so maybe we can even chat about that.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe we can perhaps have Sam on or Jordan Peterson on sometime. I don't think that's out of the question.
Oh, how fun would that be? I have to admit, I saw something I'm very jealous of before I let you go. I was looking at J. Warner Wallace's Twitter his timeline, and I saw him tell someone if they emailed him, and this is to my friend John Dunphy, who's at JMD Apologetics. He told John to email him. John offered to have him on his show, and I thought, oh, I'm so jealous. How did John get that good deal? So yes, I would love to see famous people like that, or any of the famous names out there. If they're willing to come on, I'm willing to have you. So.
Yes.
And you have a channel too. Do you want to let people know how to get to your YouTube channel?
Yeah, they can go to my YouTube channel. It's Joshua J. Brister. I believe that's it. I'm just starting out this conversation. I'm not as technologically inclined as you are, and I appreciate you being willing to help me. But for right now, you can try to find me on YouTube. I guess we'll put the link in the description. And my Promethean account, Joshua J. Brister, and on Twitter, Master Apologist. And I continue to teach world and U.S. history. That's something I study. I've been studying philosophy and economics and evolutionary psychology and so forth for 20 years for one reason: to confront culture with a sophisticated Christian apologetic. An articulated response to a secular culture uh, that carries a lot of pride with them. But anyway, I look forward to doing this again.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast, and I'm going to stay on for a second to chat with you on how you can do this on your end. Okay.